Okay, so let's start, Hugh. Everybody, welcome to this session. This is Rethinking Caribbean Travel in the Post-COVID Era. We are having a few difficulties, so some of the slides will not look as great, but it still is going to be a great presentation. I am so happy and honored to present to you my brother and namesake, Hugh Riley. I've known Hugh for a gazillion years when he was working with Barbados. And as you all know, Hugh used to be Secretary General of the CTO, which is a Caribbean tourism organization. And he brings a lot of passion, which in environmental stewardship and visitor satisfaction, working in various destinations, including when he was born in Barbados and other countries in the Caribbean. Hugh currently works at the Portfolio Marketing Group as the firm's newest partner. So Hugh, I'm so happy you're here. Take it away.
It's a pleasure and a privilege, Hugh. Thank you very much for having me. And yes, well, let's take a look at rethinking Caribbean travel. So while we rethink, we needed to do a number of really important things. First of all, we conducted lots of consumer sentiment analysis so that we could figure out really what's going on out there, what it is that people are thinking and how it's changing from one week to another. One of the things that we've learned about this pandemic is that it changes all the time. There's nobody who came into this with expertise on how to handle it. And so it was really critically important that we kept on looking at what was being said. We've monitored lots of research data from public health experts from around the world. It's important to bear that in mind as well. So in the Caribbean, there is a public health agency called CARPHA, which is the Caribbean Public Health Agency, but they interact with the CDCs in the US, they interact with their counterparts in the UK and around the world. And of course, they interact with the WHO, the World Health Organization. We've observed regional international efforts at developing, pardon me, I am just, thank you. We observed regional and international efforts at developing effective protocols, and we've paid particular attention to global trends in the industry. So let's look at where we were pre-COVID-19 in the Caribbean. The Caribbean in 2019 had a really very good year. 31.5 million stayover visitors from around the world, and about half that number came from the United States. So it's important to remember always that the Caribbean prospects for business everywhere globally, but the United States is the #1 source of visitors to the region. In terms of cruise arrivals, there were just over 30 million cruise arrivals into the Caribbean. And all of this is pre-COVID, of course, and the Caribbean was in 2019, and actually for quite some time now, the world's #1 cruise destination. About 40% or so of the world's cruise berths are in the Caribbean. Tourism is responsible for about 2.5 million jobs in the region directly, and of course indirectly the number is somewhat larger. And statistically, the Caribbean is the world's most tourism dependent region. Next. So here are some new realities. Tourism has been reduced considerably in the Caribbean as it has everywhere else. So there has been a historic fall in travel to the region, not too surprisingly. Now, the big difference, of course, is that the impact that has on the livelihood of a region where tourism is the #1 foreign exchange earner is clearly much more serious than the impact that fall in travel would have on destinations that are less tourism dependent. So the Caribbean is feeling the brunt of this historic reduction in travel, much more so than almost anywhere else on the planet. There have been massive concerns over health safety. Clearly, that's what's on consumers' minds. Brands everywhere are addressing consumers with a great more sensitivity than we've seen in the past. It's really very important to be empathetic, to understand what people's concerns are, and to address them sensitively. There have been partisan differences in the United States. Our research has shown that consumers in the US respond differently to the pandemic, based on political persuasion, quite frankly, based on their response to PPE, wearing a mask, and their response to travel has been different, according to the research, by party affiliation. There's been a complete distaste for long flights with connections. Again, that's not too shocking. People want, if not contact less, certainly less contact as they move around from their home to the destination. And the more contact they have, the more nervous they become. Hence, they're interested in fewer connections. So direct flights and nonstop flights are the order of the day. Domestic vacations are predominant, clearly. People have developed much more of an interest in staycations, in daycations, and in getting into a car and just driving with the family. Which is not to say that flying has stopped. It ground to a halt for a period of time. It's restarting, but again, destinations like the Caribbean have to really struggle and fight hard to get that business back. Domestic vacations are, in fact, the number one choice at the moment in the United States. Cruising readiness has been debated for a very long time, and it's still up in the air as to when cruising will come back in full force and how consumers will react to cruising. That is a factor that the Caribbean keeps a very close eye on for obvious reasons. We were the number one cruise destination on the planet prior to COVID-19, and there's been copious research on who will come back first, and we'll talk some more about that. Getting visitors back and determining what categories will come back first is key to this discussion. Next. So here are the first ones back. According to our research, and we've done a lot of research at PM Group, and our partners have as well on this subject. The familiars, people who are familiar with our part of the world, are much more likely to come back first. Repeat visitors, property owners. The Caribbean is one of those places where many people have, particularly people from North America and from Europe too, quite frankly, have second homes, or they have vacation ownership in one way or another, sometimes fractional ownership, but they've got a stake in the ground and they're more likely to come back. The Caribbean diaspora is far-flung, and they are certainly much more likely to be among the first back, and the Caribbean diaspora is large in North America and certainly in the United States. Caribbean people, again, don't necessarily feel the need to always go back to the country of their parents' birth, but they will consider the whole Caribbean as their own. And so Hugh Huff mentioned at the beginning that I'm from Barbados. There are people who are second and third generation Barbadians. They've perhaps never been there. And at some point they want to go and see the country of their parents' birth or their grandparents' birth. But in the meantime, they certainly will visit the rest of the Caribbean. So that's what the diaspora has tended to do. Visiting friends and relatives is clearly an important part of the habits of first generation Caribbeans, but others don't necessarily do it that way. Romantics and special interest groups are likely to be among the first back. If you have a passion for something, you are much more likely to want to exercise that passion, even when the chips are down. And the research is also showing that boaters, yachters, and people who are involved in private aviation will be among the first to come back. And not too shockingly, they're all related to that final bullet on this slide, the financially secure, with tens of millions of people affected financially in one way or another. it is clearly critical that we pay a great deal of attention to those who are financially secure. Some people are much more focused on day-to-day concerns than going on a vacation. But then there are others who feel that this is the time that they want to escape the pressures of everyday life. And clearly, it's important that we find who they are. Next. So here's what's evolving. There are new boarding procedures that are actually evolving all the time. Some of us who are accustomed to dealing with different procedures all the time are always learning what's happening, what's new and different. I was recently in fact, last week on a 5-hour flight, and it was interesting to me to, and this is not a scientific survey, obviously I was on 2 flights, and my own observations were that all that I had heard about wearing masks on board, absolutely true. There is an obsession in making sure that passengers keep their masks on all the time, with the exception of when, of course, you're going to have some sort of refreshment. The onboard staff on the airline kept their masks on the whole time as well. The whole business of not selling the middle seat is nonsense. The middle seat certainly was sold on my flight, and my flight was chock-a-block full all the way. Certainly in one direction. Coming back, it was about 75% load factor. There was certainly restricted contact on board, and that's the order of the day now. Not too much hanging around in the aisles and congregating and so on. This is just a new norm. Baggage collection, distance procedures are in force. That's evolving. I've noticed that that's much more an issue of enforcement in some airports more so than in others. And there's a complete reduction in redundancies. There's this issue of trying to weed out things that don't necessarily need to happen. Next slide, we'll go to the things that are actually still evolving. This isn't widespread yet, but it's certainly going to become, I think, more prevalent as time goes on. This whole business of doing things at home before you even get to the airport. There's a lot of discussion about baggage tag printing or some form of it. There's certainly a lot of not just discussion about immigration and customs documents being printed at home. There's more than discussion about that. Some destinations have started to do that now, international destinations, obviously. And there's a lot of discussion still about sanitizing and testing at home. Everybody now, or most reasonable people, are doing the sanitizing thing, washing hands and sanitizing everything that they can at home. But the whole business of rapid results testing at home, that's more a discussion than in practice on any widespread basis. At the airports, there are all kinds of new training methods. As you will notice, airport staff have been trained to handle passengers and passenger interactions differently. There are partitions now, glass partitions or perspex type partitions between airport staff and passengers. Sanitizing and testing has become the norm. There is a whole range now of proposals, I will call them, for there to be a lot of pre-boarding testing. I haven't seen any widespread implementation of this, but we're watching it very closely, because the notion of making sure that everyone who's sitting on that plane and everyone sitting next to them has been tested and has a negative test for COVID, that is such a confidence builder to know that everybody on that airplane has tested negative just before boarding. That will, I think, will will be a huge confidence booster for anybody who's going anywhere, and particularly to a foreign country. There's restricted terminal access that's already begun, and there are some pundits that think that this will become the order of the day in the future. We're going to have to get used to saying goodbye to our relatives and friends at home because we're not going to have access to the airport and to the actual terminal unless we're actually flying as well. Enforced physical distancing is the norm now. Increased use of self-service equipment. That's something that we've all become accustomed to, and that's not going to change, I think, in the future. And the whole business of employee personal protection equipment, that's also the norm. And so, next slide, please. And so this is what we are going to have to pay a lot of attention to in the Caribbean in terms of rethinking Caribbean travel. We're going to have to redefine international travelers. There's no sense in thinking that we can take things for granted and just go back to the way things were. That's not happening. So looking at the health and safety concerns of international travelers, that's a primary concern. We're going to have to find people, and there are ways of doing all of this, but we have to put into our consideration set the whole notion of looking for people on the basis of their appetite for risk. People who are, and this really comes down a lot to cultural and age and gender demographics, nationality, income demographics. The point is that some people within some age groups and cultural groups are likely to be more risk averse than others, and so the Caribbean, if we're to be successful in the post-COVID era, we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to finding international travelers who don't necessarily look exactly like or feel exactly like the travelers that we got in the past. Some people are going to be early adopters, that's just human nature, and some are not. Whether we're talking about international travel or we're talking about things as basic as a vaccine, some people will say, well, I'm ready to go, sign me up. And others will say, nope, not me, give me a year or two before I come back. And then we obviously have to look at those kinds of travelers in terms of whether they're likely to be traveling for leisure, for business, whether they're traveling in groups, whether the Caribbean is going to be able to attract people in large numbers for weddings and honeymoons, as we have done in the past. Then there's the business of reevaluating Caribbean travelers. Who are these people that are particularly interested in going to the Caribbean? Well, in terms of length of stay, it's an interesting thing that we're seeing in the research now within our particular group. While Americans are still showing a propensity for shorter stays, we are seeing, certainly among our client group in the Caribbean, we're seeing a number of inquiries coming to the destinations that we represent about staying for longer periods. People are starting to look at this whole business of being a digital nomad. So they're willing to be ensconced in a Caribbean destination, work remotely from there, and stay for long periods of time, sometimes for several months, sometimes for a year. It's an interesting phenomenon that we're starting to see growing in the Caribbean. Some people are, in fact, taking, some people in the United States, we've noticed, are starting to take a fairly pragmatic approach to this business of traveling to the Caribbean. And the pragmatism says, well, look, we're looking at what's a COVID-free or almost COVID-free destination. If my chances of contracting this virus are considerably less in Antigua or the Bahamas or Anguilla or Nevis or somewhere in the Caribbean, then I think that's where I'm going to go. I'm much more likely to be safe there than in whatever city I live in. People are taking this kind of pragmatic approach to it. And on top of it all, you're having a great time.
Hugh, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We have 5 minutes.
Thank you.
So you have some questions. So I was wondering if you wanted to say a wrapping statement, and then I can ask you a couple questions.
All right. We've got 5 minutes left from our session. Is that it?
Yes.
Oh, wow. All right. Then, okay. So I will just not go through this, the last few bullets in any detail, but suffice it to say that one of the things that we really need to do in the Caribbean is to re-engage with past visitors for a number of obvious reasons. And we are going to have to pay a lot of attention to reimagining the role of travel professionals. I'll talk more about that depending upon what the questions might be, but let's dive straight into the questions.
Okay, sounds good. We have a couple questions. One of them, do most islands have testing or for quarantine requirements?
Yes, in fact, there really aren't any that don't have testing and quarantine requirements. The Caribbean is obsessing about this whole idea of staying safe, making sure that its citizens and its visitors are safe. So yes, there's you cannot go to a Caribbean country unless you have a negative test. In some cases, the test has to be no older than 72 hours. In some cases, they're different lengths, and there are some that are requiring not only that you show up with a negative test, but that you get a test when you arrive. And yes, there are quarantine requirements. So there's no question about that, but it varies from one Caribbean country to another. And it's important that you make sure that you understand what the protocols are for the country that you are planning to visit.
Okay, here's another one, and you sort of touched on it before. What islands have offers for long stay trips or work out of the country? I believe Barbados does that, right?
Yeah, Barbados does. Barbados was almost first out of the gate with that. We know for sure Antigua and Barbuda does. We know that Anguilla does. I believe Jamaica does as well. There is a proposal for the same in the Bahamas. So it varies in terms of the requirements and the cost of doing so and the protocols involved. But again, we'll be happy to provide that information. But the website of whichever Caribbean country you're thinking of going to will most certainly provide that information. But yes, it's become a very popular question. Can I go to the Caribbean and live there for 6 months or a year and work remotely from there? That also has brought up another question, of course, about the accessibility and the availability of free and strong Wi-Fi, because being remote in a destination doesn't mean that you're in an outpost where you can't communicate. You must be able to communicate effectively, and the Caribbean stepped up to that plate as well.
I'm going to ask you one more, Hugh, and this was a good one. You talked a little bit about travel professionals and how critical are they to the success of the Caribbean?
I think that they're going to be amazingly important going forward. This is an environment where the Caribbean is going to be more dependent upon travel agents, travel professionals than ever before to help consumers to work through this whole maze of protocols. You can hardly find 2 or 3 airlines or 2 or 3 destinations that have the same sort of standardized protocol. I think travel professionals are going to have to help to work through all of that. Travel professionals are also going to become much more engaged in how they learn about a destination. The whole business of, just having these big fam trips from one destination to another, I think that that's kind of going to be phased out, and those initial FAMs are going to become more online virtual tours, and the more immersive destination experiences are the ones that are going to happen on island, on the destination in the Caribbean. But I think that travel professionals, certainly in this country, United States, will become much more immersive in their knowledge of the Caribbean, and they will be much more important in terms of making the decisions about which Caribbean destination to choose.
Okay, Hugh. Well, we need to wrap it up because our session is almost over. What I'll do, if there are any other questions, I'm going to forward them to you so you could answer them. Hugh, I want to thank you so much for participating in this. It's awesome to see you again, even though you have that funny thing on your face. So great to see you, Hugh, and thank you so much for being part of Rethink.
It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry we ran out of time, but certainly, as you said, I'll be happy to answer any questions after the fact.
Okay, great. And thank you everybody for attending. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.